The night of November 12th, 2011, was supposed to be ordinary in Rexburg, Idaho, a town framed by potato fields, ranches, and the steady hum of the I-15 highway. Under the glow of neon lights, the Chevron station stood like a beacon for truckers and late-night travelers. Inside, 26-year-old Ethan Moore began his night shift, quiet, dependable, and unseen by the world beyond those glass doors. At 10:15 p.m., he called his wife Rachel, promising breakfast with her and their little boy in the morning. That promise would never be kept. By dawn, when a coworker arrived, the scene was eerily still. The cash register sat untouched, bills neatly stacked. The front door was ajar, lights buzzing faintly in the cold air. Ethan wasn't at the counter. He wasn't anywhere in sight. As the worker stepped into the storage room, the nightmare revealed itself. Ethan lay face down on the concrete floor, covered by a blanket as though someone wanted to hide the brutality beneath. He had been stabbed 18 times. His wallet was still in his pocket. His watch still gleamed on his wrist. Beside him, a broken knife blade glistened, its handle discarded. Shoe prints not his own were pressed into the blood-stained concrete, and a plastic water bottle with smears of red lay in the trash. The scene screamed of rage, not robbery. A frenzy so violent it left behind blood that didn't belong to Ethan, blood that would sit for years, sealed inside evidence bags, waiting for science to catch up. If you were standing in that storage room, could you look at that blanket and not wonder who put it there and why? Before we unseal what these cold case files have guarded for a decade, subscribe and keep this investigation in the light. Rexburg, Idaho, in 2011 was the kind of town that prided itself on safety. Rows of potato fields stretched toward the horizon, punctuated by farmhouses and small churches. The I-15 highway cut through the land like a steel artery, carrying truckers and travelers to larger cities. But life inside Rexburg moved at the rhythm of harvests, college semesters, and Sunday sermons. For most residents, crime was something they read about in the news from other states. To them, Rexburg was quiet, almost insulated. That illusion would soon shatter, but in the fall of 2011, people still believed their small community was immune to the violence of the outside world. At the heart of this story stood Ethan Moore, a young man of just 26. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, and he never sought attention. Yet everyone who knew him described the same qualities: gentle, hardworking, and devoted to his family. Ethan lived with his wife Rachel and their 2-year-old son in a modest home just a short drive from the Chevron station off the highway. To Rachel, he was not just a husband, but also her steady anchor, someone who could make her laugh even in the midst of long, tiring days. To their little boy, he was the center of the world, the one who carried him on his shoulders and turned simple bedtime rituals into adventures. During the day, Ethan often helped his father-in-law with farm chores, repairing fences, checking irrigation, small jobs that made him feel useful and connected to family. But steady income was scarce in Rexburg, and the night shift at the Chevron provided the additional pay he needed to build a secure future for his wife and child. While most people dreaded the long hours under fluorescent lights and the steady stream of strangers on the highway, Ethan accepted it. For him, it was a sacrifice worth making. A few sleepless nights were nothing compared to the stability he wanted for his family. Night shift, however, carried invisible risks. Gas stations along major highways are liminal spaces, halfway points where anyone can pass through. Long-haul truckers, drifters, late-night students, even people running from something in their lives. The unpredictability of who might walk through the door meant Ethan faced far greater exposure to danger than most of Rexburg's residents. Criminologists often explain this through what's called routine activity theory. Crime happens when three factors intersect: an available target, a motivated offender, and the absence of capable guardians. On the night of November 12th, 2011, Ethan tragically became that available target. His routine placed him in an isolated workplace, late at night, with little protection. The perfect storm for something terrible to happen. Still, friends and family never described Ethan as fearful. He was pragmatic, careful, and had the kind of easy patience that made him well suited to customer service. Truckers remembered him for his polite small talk, students for his quiet smile when they grabbed snacks after midnight. To his co-workers, he was reliable, the man who would cover shifts, show up on time, and never complain. If there was one word that defined him, it was steady. That very steadiness made his violent death all the more shocking. On the evening of November 12th, Ethan followed the same routine he had countless times before. He put on a heavy jacket against the November chill and grabbed the lunch Rachel had packed. He kissed his son goodnight, promising to be back for breakfast in the morning. Rachel later recalled how his voice carried that same warmth it always did, the kind of calm assurance that made her feel safe. For her, there was no reason to suspect that night would be different from any other. Imagine kissing your child goodnight, not knowing it's the last time. That haunting thought became a wound Rachel would carry for years. Because for Ethan, that ordinary farewell marked the final moment of normalcy before he walked into a night that would end in violence. At the Chevron station, Ethan clocked in, switched on the neon signs, and prepared for the long hours ahead. The night shift was always a mixed bag, sometimes slow, sometimes hectic, depending on highway traffic. On a Saturday night, he could expect a handful of truckers, maybe a few students heading back to Brigham Young University, Idaho, and the occasional weary traveler needing directions or a cup of coffee. For Ethan, the work was monotonous but manageable. He stocked shelves, checked the cooler, and greeted whoever walked through the glass doors with that same polite nod. But criminology tells us something unsettling. Predictability and routine is both a comfort and a vulnerability. Offenders often exploit patterns, knowing where someone will be, when they will be alone, and how isolated the environment is. Ethan's dedication, his willingness to take the late shift, unwittingly placed him into that vulnerable cycle. The Chevron was bright, but it was also a magnet for strangers. The cameras were outdated, the storage room poorly lit, and there was no second employee to share the shift. It was, in many ways, a fragile island of light surrounded by darkness. By 10:15 p.m., Ethan made a quick call home to Rachel. He promised her he would come back early, that they would eat breakfast together with their son. His voice was calm, filled with warmth. It would be the last time she heard it. As hours passed, the highway thinned. The familiar glow of the Chevron sign stood against the black sky, visible from miles away. Inside, Ethan went through his usual tasks. But somewhere outside, perhaps on the very edge of the lot, someone else was moving, watching, waiting. The danger of such moments is that they rarely announce themselves. To an outsider, the station looked safe, register full of cash, shelves neatly stocked, employee behind the counter. But beneath that surface, all three elements of routine activity theory were aligning. Ethan was the available target. A motivated offender had drawn near, and there was no capable guardian present to deter what was about to unfold. For Rachel, the hours ticked by in quiet domestic routine, her son asleep, the house dark, and the promise of breakfast in the morning. For Ethan, every moment was unknowingly carrying him closer to the end. That juxtaposition, one family resting in peace while their anchor fought for survival in a gas station storage room, would haunt Rexburg for years to come. By the time dawn arrived and his coworker pushed open the Chevron's glass door, the devastation was complete. But in these early hours of the narrative, before we return to the crime itself, we must pause on the life that was stolen. Ethan Moore was not just a name in a police file. He was a husband, a father, a son, a man whose dreams were simple: provide for his family, raise his child, and keep faith in the quiet rhythms of a small town. And that is why this case struck so deep into the heart of Rexburg. Because if someone like Ethan, ordinary, decent, steady, could be taken so violently in the middle of his routine, then safety itself felt like an illusion. If careful storytelling matters to you, tap like. Each share helps these cold case files reach someone who might recognize a missing detail. The first rays of morning light crept over Rexburg on November 13th, 2011. The town was quiet, fields still wrapped in frost, the streets nearly empty. At the Chevron station off I-15, a co-worker arrived to relieve Ethan Moore from his overnight shift. What he saw would mark the beginning of a nightmare. The glass front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the cold air. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over rows of soda cans, candy, and chips. Nothing looked immediately out of place. The register drawer was closed, the shelves were stocked, and the neon open sign still buzzed. But something was wrong. Ethan wasn't at the counter. He wasn't restocking shelves. He wasn't anywhere in sight. The coworker called his name, first casually, then with growing urgency. The store remained silent. He checked the small bathroom, empty. He looked behind the counter. No trace. The dread grew heavier with each step. Then he pushed open the door to the narrow storage room at the back. There, on the cold concrete floor, lay Ethan Moore. He was face down, his body partially concealed beneath an old blanket pulled from a nearby shelf. The blanket was stained, darkened by blood that had soaked deeply into the fabric. From beneath it, the still outline of his frame told the coworker everything. Ethan was gone. The coworker stumbled back, trembling, before grabbing his phone and calling 911. Within minutes, the area was cordoned off. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the Chevron lot as Madison County deputies and Rexburg police arrived. Officers exchanged grim glances. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something far more violent. When investigators first entered the storage room, the evidence hit them like a series of brutal exclamation marks. Ethan's body bore signs of multiple stab wounds, later counted at 18. Nearby lay a broken knife, its black plastic handle snapped cleanly from the blade. The blade itself was found several feet away, as though it had flown loose in the frenzy of the struggle. The clean break suggested enormous force, far beyond what would be expected in a controlled attack. The register in the front remained full of cash. Ethan's wallet was still in his pocket, his watch glinting on his wrist, his wedding ring unmoved on his finger. Nothing of value was missing. Would you call it a robbery when the register is untouched? The answer for investigators was immediate. This wasn't theft. It was rage. Someone had come into the Chevron with a fury that spilled out in 18 strikes of a blade. And after the violence, the killer had done something chilling. He had covered Ethan's body with a blanket. That simple act wasn't for concealment. Anyone who opened the door would find the body almost instantly. It was a behavior often seen in post-offense psychology, a gesture of shame, panic, or conflicted emotion. Covering the victim suggested the killer wasn't detached. He couldn't bear to look at what he had done. The forensic team quickly moved in. Each square foot of the storage room was photographed. Orange markers flagged the broken knife, the blanket, and several shoe prints pressed into the floor. The prints were larger than Ethan's shoes and led toward the back exit. Investigators carefully poured plaster into them to preserve their shape. The size and depth of the impressions suggested a man heavier and taller than Ethan, fleeing in haste after the attack. A discarded plastic water bottle was found in the trash. Its cap bore faint reddish smears. Under the black powder of fingerprint dusting, partial prints began to emerge. Inside, there was still a small amount of liquid, evidence sealed for later analysis. Technicians swabbed blood from 2 different locations, the blanket and the knife handle. One matched Ethan's blood type, but the other, darker and more distinct, did not. This was critical. The killer likely injured himself during the stabbing, leaving behind his own DNA. That second blood sample became the most precious evidence of the case, the thread that could one day unravel the mystery. Meanwhile, Ethan's body was carefully examined in situ. The wounds were clustered in the chest and abdomen, overlapping in some areas where the killer had struck again and again. To seasoned detectives, this pattern shouted overkill. Overkill is not random. It often points to rage or personal connection. Someone who simply wanted money would have threatened Ethan, taken cash, and fled. Someone who wanted to kill cleanly might have used a gun, a single decisive strike. But 18 stab wounds? That was frenzy. That was personal. Detectives discussed this at the scene. One officer, his gloves stained from dusting, muttered, "No one stabs for cash." This wasn't about money. Whoever did this lost control. Another noted the broken blade. The kind of force required to snap steel suggested the killer was striking with such violence that the weapon itself couldn't withstand it. Forensic psychology teaches that such acts reveal as much about the offender's mind as about the crime itself. A controlled, professional killer leaves minimal traces, executes efficiently, and disappears. An offender who delivers excessive wounds is often driven by emotion, anger, humiliation, revenge. Covering the body afterward suggests guilt, regret, or a sudden fear of what had just been done. It's a paradox. The killer had enough presence of mind to drape a blanket, but not enough to erase shoe prints or hide the broken knife. This was rage colliding with panic. As evidence was logged, officers noted the eerie stillness of the chevron. The shelves of soda and candy stood untouched. The hum of the refrigerator mixed with the buzz of neon lights. Everything looked frozen in time, except for the horror in the back room. The co-worker who discovered Ethan was escorted outside, still trembling, repeating the same words. The register, the lights, everything was normal. Except Ethan wasn't there. That phrase echoed in reports, emphasizing how completely ordinary the station seemed until the storage room door opened. At headquarters later, detectives began piecing together what they had. The cold case files would later show this in stark order. 8s, body covered with blanket. 18 stab wounds. Broken knife blade and handle. Shoe prints leading to rear exit. Water bottle with blood traces. Register intact, wallet and valuables untouched. Each point painted the same picture. This was not a robbery. It was personal violence. But the question lingered. Personal to whom? Ethan was known as a gentle, friendly man. He had no enemies, no disputes that anyone could recall. If the attack was so personal, how could the killer remain invisible? Comment your first instinct. Personal rage, or a stranger's frenzy. Your perspective keeps these cold case files alive. The forensic team pressed further. They lifted scrapings from beneath Ethan's fingernails, finding tiny threads of fabric. Perhaps in his last moments, he had grabbed at his attacker, clawing desperately for survival. The fibers were bagged for later comparison. Defensive wounds on his arms suggested he fought, raising his hands to block the blows. This, too, carried psychological weight. It showed not just Ethan's resistance, but the intensity of the assault. A weaker attack might have been deflected. Here, the knife had pierced again and again through defense. The shoe prints added another layer. They were not from Ethan's shoes, but a larger size, deeply pressed into the blood. Analysts concluded the suspect likely fled quickly, pressing down hard as he moved. The direction toward the back door suggested a hurried exit away from the main counter, avoiding exposure to the highway. Investigators theorized the killer may have been familiar with the layout. Someone who knew the back storage area existed, someone who knew how to leave unseen. And then, the blanket. Covering a victim is a detail that unsettles investigators. Some killers do it to symbolically erase the face of the person they've just harmed. Others, paradoxically, do it out of a warped sense of respect, unable to look at the lifeless body. Still others act in sheer panic, grabbing whatever is near to make the scene feel less horrifying to themselves. In Ethan's case, the blanket came from the very shelves he used to cover goods. That detail suggested the act wasn't planned. It was improvised, born of the killer's immediate emotional reaction. Criminologists often classify such actions as post-offense behavior, things offenders do after the killing that reveal their state of mind. Some flee without a trace. Some wipe fingerprints. Some stage the scene to mislead police. Here, the behavior pointed to emotional conflict. The offender may not have planned to kill, but once it happened, he couldn't bear the reality of the act. He left DNA, shoe prints, a broken weapon, all while attempting to symbolically cover his crime. In reports later filed, detectives would underline these contradictions. Calculated enough to grab a blanket, reckless enough to leave blood. Forceful enough to break a blade, yet hesitant enough to hide the body. This wasn't the work of a professional. This was the eruption of a volatile man, trapped in his own rage. As the autopsy would later confirm, the 18 stab wounds were clustered, overlapping, and delivered with ferocity. Many cut into the same regions repeatedly, suggesting the attacker continued stabbing even after Ethan could no longer resist. That detail haunted investigators. It meant the killer wasn't simply ensuring death, he was venting fury. The crime scene, sealed and catalogued, became the foundation of a mystery that would torment Rexburg for years. Every item bagged, every photograph logged, every plaster cast poured became part of the record. Those records, the evidence, the swabs, the photographs, would sit in storage when the case went cold. They would become the backbone of the cold case files, waiting for a time when science could translate their silent testimony into a name. For now, in late 2011, they told only part of the story. A young man brutally murdered. A killer driven by rage. A town's illusion of safety shattered. And a family left with a silence that no blanket could cover. The morning after Ethan Moore's body was discovered in the Chevron storage room, the Madison County Coroner's Office became the center of grim activity. Under harsh fluorescent lights, every detail of the young man's injuries would be recorded. For investigators, the autopsy wasn't just procedure, it was the closest thing to hearing Ethan's final struggle speak back from silence. The examination began with external documentation. Ethan's skin bore dozens of abrasions and bruises, most concentrated on his forearms, hands, and shoulders. These were identified as classic defensive wounds, injuries sustained when someone raises their arms in a desperate attempt to fend off an attack. His knuckles carried faint scratches, suggesting he fought back. The bruising on his cheek implied at least one heavy blow to the face, while deeper bruises across his shoulder showed forceful impact, possibly being pinned to the concrete floor. Then came the most striking finding. The coroner cataloged 18 stab wounds, nearly all clustered in the chest and abdomen. Many overlapped, showing the blade had pierced the same entry points multiple times. Several penetrated so deeply they struck vital organs, the heart, liver, and lungs. One wound alone could have been fatal, but the repetition revealed something else. Not control, not intimidation, but frenzy. At this point in the timeline, pause and imagine the diagram that forensic pathologists use. Lines drawn across a human outline, each number marking a stab wound. If you saw these wounds charted on a body diagram, what story would they tell you about anger? This wasn't a surgical, targeted attack. It was overkill, a term in forensic psychology for violence that goes far beyond what is necessary to end a life. Overkill is often tied to emotional eruption, rage, hatred, or panic. It can suggest the killer either knew the victim or was consumed by uncontrollable emotion in the moment. Investigators flagged this immediately. Someone had not only wanted Ethan dead, they had wanted him destroyed. Further analysis deepened the profile. The coroner identified 2 sets of blood on the blanket covering Ethan. One was his, predictable and consistent. The other, however, was distinct, slightly darker in hue, coagulated differently. This foreign blood indicated the assailant had injured themselves, most likely when the knife broke. When the steel blade snapped from its plastic handle, tremendous force must have been applied. That kind of breakage usually occurs when the blade strikes bone. In the struggle, the killer likely lost control of the weapon, sustaining a cut severe enough to leave droplets on the blanket. That single detail became critical. Proof that the killer bled in the very act of stabbing Ethan. The autopsy also estimated time of death. Based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and chemical markers, Ethan's death was placed between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. This window aligned hauntingly well with multiple accounts from nearby residents. Around midnight, an elderly couple across the street reported hearing a loud metallic clanging and a short, sharp shout. Just minutes later, a farm owner said her dog barked furiously for nearly 10 minutes before suddenly going quiet. These reports, though not definitive, created a chilling timeline. The metallic sound could have been the knife breaking. The shout, Ethan's final cry. The barking, an instinctive response to violence in the quiet of the night. Still, investigators knew the limits of witness memory. Psychology warns us that late-night perception is fragile. Dim lighting, stress, and distance distort recall. What one person describes as metallic clanging might be a trash can falling. What another insists was a shout might be a car door slamming. Memory is notoriously malleable, easily reshaped by suggestion or the passage of time. That's why, even when the community was eager to help, detectives treated these accounts as supporting context rather than hard evidence. What could be trusted, however, was the behavioral signature at the crime scene. Covering Ethan's body with a blanket was a post-defense action that spoke volumes. Offenders who conceal a victim, even partially, often experience a surge of guilt or panic after the killing. It can be an unconscious attempt to undo the horror of their actions, to hide what they've done from their own eyes. Others interpret it as symbolic respect, covering the victim because, despite the violence, some shred of humanity remains. Whatever the intent, it was an unmistakable psychological clue. This killer wasn't purely cold-blooded. He reacted afterward, revealing conflict inside himself. The broken knife told another story. In homicide analysis, a snapped blade often points to chaotic close contact. Professional killers rarely use fragile weapons. They prepare tools that won't fail. A cheap folding knife breaking mid-attack suggests the killer came unprepared, escalating from confrontation to murder in the heat of the moment. This leaned investigators away from theories of a hired hit or calculated plan. Instead, it supported the idea of an impulsive act by someone overcome with fury, or someone who intended only intimidation, but spiraled into uncontrollable rage. Next, the forensic team examined shoe prints cast in plaster from the storage room floor. They were larger than Ethan's shoes, deeply imprinted, and suggested rapid, forceful movement. Analysts could not immediately match them to a brand, but the depth implied a heavier individual, possibly over 180 pounds, running or stomping in the struggle. These prints led directly to the back door, as though the killer fled once Ethan collapsed. They didn't wander through the aisles, didn't open the cash register. That absence spoke louder than theft. Would you call it a robbery when the register is untouched? The answer was clear. This wasn't about money. The violence was personal, the rage undeniable. Whether Ethan knew the attacker or whether the killer's anger was sparked in the moment, robbery could be definitively ruled out. This observation later became part of the official scene reconstruction. As detectives compiled these findings, the autopsy report itself was entered into the official cold case files, preserved alongside crime scene photographs and witness statements. Every detail, from the broken knife fragments to the foreign blood, was logged with painstaking care. The file was more than paperwork. It was a time capsule, waiting for future technology to unlock what 2011 science could not. Yet, at this stage of the investigation, the challenge was immense. Witnesses were shaky, the weapon was broken and common, and no suspect was immediately apparent. Detectives debated endlessly. Was this an act of personal rage from someone Ethan knew? Or was it a drifter, a stranger passing through the interstate who erupted in violence for reasons unknown? To weigh these options, they turned back to psychology. Overkill, as displayed in Ethan's injuries, often suggests a personal connection. Studies in forensic criminology show that strangers usually stab only as much as needed to escape or control. But repeated plunges, 18 wounds concentrated in vital areas, point to raw emotion, a target who represented something to the killer. It's rage you don't see in opportunistic crimes. At the same time, the behavior after, the covering with a blanket, the flight through the back door, could fit a stranger panicking after losing control. Rage doesn't always require history. Sometimes it's born in seconds, fueled by stress, drugs, or paranoia. The ambiguity frustrated the team. Forensic science could explain the wounds, but not the relationship between victim and killer. At 27, Iwazero, the narrative turned outward, to you, the viewer. Drop your theory below, rage from someone known, or an encounter that spiraled. We read every comment because these cold case files thrive on your insight. 8. The question wasn't rhetorical. For investigators, it mirrored the actual debates that dominated the early case meetings. One camp insisted Ethan must have known his killer, perhaps a customer or acquaintance harboring resentment. The other argued it could have been anyone who walked in that night, an argument that spiraled into a storm of blood. The disagreement underscored the fragile balance of evidence versus interpretation in every homicide investigation. Meanwhile, time of death estimates grew more important. The 11, 30p, M to 12, 30A, M, window aligned with Rachel's last phone call from Ethan at 10, 15p, M, and the co-worker's arrival at 6, A, M. Investigators saw this midnight gap as the fatal hour, matching it with the elderly couple's report of a clang and shout, and the dog barking, gave weight to the witness statements, however imperfect. The chorus of small details, metallic sound, muffled cry, animal instinct, wove into the autopsy's silent testimony. It didn't prove guilt, but it painted a chilling narrative of those final minutes. By the end of the autopsy phase, investigators had built a clearer profile of the murder than on the chaotic morning of discovery. The evidence pointed to violence exploding in the storage room. A confrontation, a struggle, a knife breaking, and a killer bleeding before fleeing. It revealed a timeline anchored between Rachel's last call and the morning discovery. And it revealed psychological layers, the impulsive fury, the panic of covering the body, the contradiction between rage and remorse. Yet, for all these breakthroughs, one question remained unsolved. Who bled in that storage room alongside Ethan? That single mystery would define the years to come. In the weeks following the autopsy, detectives faced the immense task of transforming fragments of evidence into viable suspects. The broken knife, the shoe prints, the foreign blood sample, all of it pointed to a killer who had left pieces of himself behind. But names were needed, not just patterns. The first approach was practical. Identify people who had reason to be near the Chevron station, and people who might have had conflict with Ethan Moore. The earliest suspect was a man who fit neatly into both categories. Gary Collins, a long-haul trucker, had been a regular customer at the Chevron. Weeks before Ethan's murder, Gary had erupted in anger when Ethan refused to sell him alcohol after legal hours. Witnesses recalled him slamming a soda can on the counter and snapping, "You'll regret disrespecting me." The remark was noted in the incident log and now resurfaced as a potential motive. Investigators brought Gary in. He was initially furious at being questioned, swearing at the inconvenience, but eventually calmed. His alibi was straightforward. He had checked into a motel in Idaho Falls that night. A receipt confirmed the stay, and staff recalled seeing him. DNA taken from a cheek swab came back negative against the foreign blood sample. Whatever his temper, Gary hadn't been the man in the storage room. Next came Kevin Ramirez, a former Chevron employee. Fired a year earlier for siphoning gas to resell, Kevin had left angrily, telling managers they'd regret firing him. He was remembered as volatile, holding grudges. When questioned, Kevin appeared nervous and evasive, frequently shifting his story about where he had been on November 12th. He finally claimed he was at his sister's birthday party in Pocatello, over 60 miles away. His sister confirmed he had been present, though she could not pinpoint the precise hours. Police swabbed his DNA as well. The results were conclusive. No match. Kevin's suspicious behavior might have been guilt over his past theft, but it wasn't guilt over murder. A third man was considered simply because of geography. Alan Bishop, a homeless drifter, often lingered around Rexburg and was known to sleep behind buildings. Residents remembered seeing him near the Chevron. His disheveled appearance and erratic behavior made him an easy target for suspicion. When officers tracked him down in a nearby park, Alan admitted visiting the station occasionally for water, but insisted he had been sleeping in an abandoned church that night. No one could corroborate his story. Still, DNA testing quickly cleared him. His profile didn't match the killer's blood from the blanket. At this point in the investigation, all three suspects, each plausible in their own way, were eliminated by hard science. DNA was the sharp edge cutting through speculation. For detectives who had spent nights debating motive and temperament, the results carried a painful lesson. It didn't matter how suspicious a suspect looked, how angry their past behavior, or how shaky their alibi seemed. If their DNA didn't match the sample from the scene, they weren't the killer. Here lies one of the most common pitfalls in early investigations: the familiar face bias. Communities and even police often assume the killer must be someone known, someone who caused trouble before. Gary, the hot-tempered trucker, Kevin, the disgruntled ex-employee, Alan, the unstable drifter, they each embodied a ready-made narrative. But bias clouds judgment. Profiling built on assumptions rather than evidence can consume resources, stall momentum, and create false certainty. The Chevron case became a textbook example. Detectives invested days chasing men who, in the end, were innocent. Yet the frustration was real. Imagine being an investigator at that table, staring at 3 files, each seemingly pointing toward a suspect, only to have them vanish in a lab report. Would you have crossed him off the list that quickly? The question stung inside the department. Some argued too much weight was given to DNA, that an imperfect sample might exclude someone unfairly. Others countered that DNA was the only objective truth left in a case where memory faltered and motives blurred. The debate underscored the tension between old-fashioned detective instinct and the cold precision of forensics. By early 2012, the case had stalled. Detectives widened their net, interviewing more than 24 people. Old classmates of Ethan, co-workers from farm jobs, other truckers who had passed through. Each was checked, some reluctantly swabbed for DNA. Every result came back negative. None matched the blood left on the blanket and knife handle. What began as confidence in the DNA sample slowly turned into despair. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint in hand, yet it belonged to no one they could identify. The psychological toll on the investigative team grew visible. In weekly briefings, younger officers fidgeted, notebooks blank because no new leads arrived. Veterans sighed heavily, warning against blind hope. In private, one detective confessed to a colleague, "It's like chasing a ghost that bled once and then disappeared." The phrase stuck, echoing through the halls of the Rexburg Police Department, the Chevron ghost. For Rachel Moore and Ethan's family, this cycle of suspects and dismissals was torture. Each new name raised fragile hope. Each DNA exclusion shattered it. Reporters pressed for updates, and police had little to offer. Headlines drifted from "Chevron murder suspect questioned" to "all suspects cleared." The shift was stark, and public confidence eroded. Residents began locking doors earlier, warning their children to avoid the gas station at night. Fear lingered in small-town routines. From a criminological standpoint, this phase of the case revealed 2 painful truths. First, profiling by instinct is dangerously seductive. It feels logical to suspect the man who made threats, or the one with a grudge, or the outsider who looks unstable. But homicide isn't always committed by the obvious villain. Second, DNA exclusions are invaluable. In a fog of speculation, they preserve the integrity of justice by preventing innocent people from being railroaded. Without DNA, Gary, Kevin, or Alan might have been charged on circumstantial grounds, a mistake that would have haunted the community as much as the real unsolved murder. Still, logic did little to soothe the sting of inertia. By the spring of 2012, detectives logged their frustration in internal memos. No active suspects. All viable leads exhausted. Unidentified DNA remains critical. The words read like a surrender note. Each page of the growing file seemed heavier than the last. Officers avoided eye contact during case reviews, aware that no progress would be reported. The weight of failure pressed hardest on those who had promised Rachel answers. The emotional burden of dead ends is an often overlooked side of criminal investigation. Detectives are human. They absorb the grief of families, the pressure of headlines, the gnawing guilt of time slipping away. Some cope by doubling down on procedure, others by distancing emotionally. But the Chevron case resisted both strategies. It stayed raw, unresolved, too close to home for comfort. Every officer who drove past that glowing Chevron sign at night was reminded of the blank space in their own work. By early 2013, the case was quietly shifted to cold status. Evidence was sealed, reports filed, and the box labeled. Ethan Moore, Chevron homicide, 2011. For the investigators, it was more than paperwork. It was an admission of defeat. The once bright trail of blood, shoe prints, and broken steel had dimmed into silence. No suspect, no motive, no justice. Just a name on a box in the archive room, at 37. 30, the narrative opens outward again. 8s. If you've ever watched a lead go cold, share this. Someone out there might recognize a pattern hidden in these cold case files. 8s, because that was the truth. Sometimes cases survive not through breakthroughs in the lab or flashes of detective brilliance, but because someone remembers, someone connects a dot years later, someone refuses to let the silence win. By the spring of 2013, Ethan Moore's murder had been officially moved into cold status. His case box, marked Chevron Homicide 2011, sat quietly in the Madison County Archive, the edges of its cardboard already softening under fluorescent storage lights. To the detectives, it was a bitter symbol. For Rachel Moore and her young son Jacob, it was something far worse. A daily reminder that justice had not come and might never arrive. For Rachel, life became a balancing act between grief and survival. At home, Ethan's shoes still stood neatly by the door, untouched. His photograph remained on the living room wall, and Jacob often stared at it before bed. Each night, Rachel faced the impossible task of answering questions her son should never have had to ask. When's Dad coming back? Why can't the police find him? She offered the only answer she could. We're waiting, and we're still fighting for him. Psychologists call this state ambiguous loss, a grief without closure, where the loved one is gone, but the absence is unresolved. It corrodes slowly, eroding certainty, denying the rituals that normally heal. Rachel turned that grief into persistence. Every November, on the anniversary of Ethan's death, she organized a small memorial at the Chevron station. Friends, church members, co-workers, and strangers gathered with candles and flowers. They sang hymns under the cold Idaho sky, their voices trembling in the frosted air. Local newspapers covered these events faithfully, running headlines like "Family Still Seeks Justice in Chevron Case" or 2 years later, "Rexburg Remembers Ethan Moore." These stories became part of the community's collective rhythm, revisited once a year like an open wound. But anniversaries only highlighted the silence that stretched between them. Inside the police department, the cold case file was occasionally revisited, then returned to its shelf. Investigators admitted off the record that they were out of options. For Rachel, this silence was unbearable. At church potlucks, she would quietly remind others to pray for Ethan. At town meetings, she stood during the public comment period, urging officials not to forget. Yet, despite her efforts, days still slipped into months, and months into years. Rexburg itself bore scars from the unsolved crime. This was a small town where neighbors waved across yards, where Sunday services brought nearly everyone together, and where crime had rarely been more than a shoplifting headline. Suddenly, fear seeped into daily life. Women avoided stopping for gas alone after dark. Parents told teenagers to travel in pairs. College students at BYU, Idaho whispered about the Chevron ghost, an eerie shorthand for the danger that still lingered. Sociologists call this a fear ecology. When one violent act alters routines, reshapes trust, and lingers like a shadow over public spaces. The Chevron station, once just a pit stop, became a site of unease. Customers still came for gas, but glances over shoulders and quickened steps marked their visits. Employees admitted that night shifts felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. In subtle ways, Ethan's murder continued to change the town's behavior, even years later. By 2015, 4 years after Ethan's death, local journalists were still running short anniversary pieces. One read, "Chevron homicide remains unsolved. Family waits for breakthrough." These articles kept the story alive, but they also reinforced frustration. Each year, the wording was nearly identical. Each year, no new progress was reported. Residents began to feel trapped in repetition, a loop of memory without resolution. At 41, EU0, the story turns directly to you. 8. If this were your family, how long could you live with silence? 8. That silence was the essence of the Moore family's suffering. Friends offered comfort, but comfort eventually turned to awkwardness. What more could be said after years of no progress? Some withdrew, not out of cruelty, but because the pain was too heavy to witness repeatedly. Rachel, meanwhile, carried the weight alone. Jacob's growth became a timeline of loss. By age 7, he no longer asked when his father was coming back. By age 10, he asked instead why the man who killed him hadn't been caught. Rachel had no answer. This was the cruelest dimension of ambiguous loss. The child had to grow up in the shadow of a question no one could answer. Sociologists studying communities after violent crime note how collective memory takes shape. In Rexburg, Ethan's murder became more than a family's tragedy. It became a story retold at family dinners, in whispered warnings, in sermons about the fragility of life. The Chevron ghost was not folklore, but it had the same haunting quality. It symbolized vulnerability, a reminder that violence could intrude even in a quiet town, framed by potato fields and mountain winds. Within the police department, the pressure was equally corrosive. Detectives carried the guilt of an unsolved homicide. Younger officers felt the weight of public mistrust. Veterans bristled at press conferences where they could only repeat, "The case remains open. We continue to pursue leads." Everyone knew the truth, that the leads had gone cold, the evidence sealed away, and resources stretched thin. Some officers described feeling haunted not just by the crime, but by the weight of failure itself. This dual suffering, the family's ambiguous loss and the town's fear ecology, kept the case alive in memory, but stagnant in resolution. Local media played a crucial role. Each anniversary article renewed attention. Each interview with Rachel renewed sympathy. But media coverage also emphasized the stasis. No new leads, still unsolved. Family waits another year. It was a cruel refrain, turning Ethan's case into a ritual of frustration. By 2018, 7 years after the murder, community fatigue was setting in. The memorials grew smaller. Attendance waned, and candles flickered fewer in number. Rachel persisted, but she admitted to friends that she felt isolated. Yet, even as support thinned, she refused to let Ethan's memory disappear. Each November, she lit a candle, even if she was alone. For her, letting the case slip into silence would be the final betrayal. She told a reporter once, "I don't want my husband's name to be just another file in a dusty box. He deserves more." 8. And so, as this section closes at 44, 30, the call extends outward again. 8. Support the families who wait. Share this so these cold case files don't gather dust. 8. Because the truth was stark. The Chevron case had entered its coldest years. No suspect, no match, no justice. But the persistence of memory, through family grief, community fear, and media repetition, kept the embers alive. The silence was brutal, but silence did not erase the story. By 2021, nearly a decade had passed since Ethan Moore's murder. His case sat in archives as one of many unsolved homicides haunting Idaho. Yet, across the nation, forensic science had quietly entered a new era. Traditional DNA searches, limited to CODIS, the federal database of convicted offenders, were no longer the only path. Investigators now had access to a different frontier: genetic genealogy, a technique that could transform anonymous genetic code into a map of family connections. When Idaho's newly formed cold case unit reopened Ethan's file, the blood sample preserved on the blanket was sent to a California laboratory specializing in whole genome sequencing. Technicians carefully unsealed the vial, cleaned the degraded sample, and used advanced repair enzymes to reconstruct fragmented strands. Unlike the 2011 analysis that examined only short, repeating sections of DNA, the 2021 process read millions of markers across the entire genome. The result was no longer just a code for CODIS. It was a genetic fingerprint rich enough to be compared against public databases. The lab uploaded the profile to consumer genealogy networks, where millions of Americans voluntarily submit their DNA to trace ancestry. Immediately, matches began to appear. Not close relatives, no brother or cousin, but third cousins, distant links sharing only small genetic segments. Still, these faint matches were enough. From them, genealogists could begin assembling a sprawling family tree stretching across multiple generations. At 47, year 0, the story pivots to you. 8s. If a family tree pointed to your street, would you feel relief or dread? 8s. For the investigators, the answer was both. Relief because, after a decade of silence, there was finally direction. Dread because the tree narrowed not to a nameless drifter, but to a family long rooted in Idaho Falls, just miles from Rexburg. Step by step, researchers built the branches backward from distant cousins, cross-referencing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and public records. They eliminated lines with deceased males or those too young in 2011. By the end, 3 living men fit the genetic and geographic profile. One of them had lived and worked within a short drive of the Chevron station the night Ethan was killed. This technique, genetic genealogy, has revolutionized modern investigation. But it also demands painstaking patience. A single match to a distant relative is like spotting one spark in a dark forest. It takes dozens of records, hours of research, and constant verification to trace the path back to the flame. In Ethan's case, the flame pointed to Mark Ellison, a maintenance technician in his early 40s at the time of the murder. Ellison's profile was unnervingly ordinary. Married, father of 2, homeowner, church attendee. His record contained only minor disturbances, an old bar fight, a traffic violation. Nothing that screamed killer. Yet the genetic genealogy was undeniable. His family tree intersected precisely with the unknown DNA. The question was no longer whether he was related. It was whether he was the man who left blood on Ethan's blanket. Detectives began surveillance. They observed Ellison's daily routines, driving his pickup to work, stopping at a cafe, attending services on Sunday. Outwardly, his life was unremarkable. Inwardly, the investigators considered a chilling concept psychologists call dual life psychology. Many offenders capable of extreme violence construct an outward mask of stability, jobs, families, church pews, while hiding guilt deep within. This split existence allows them to move unnoticed through communities, even years after their crimes. Ellison seemed to embody that duality. Ordinary neighbor on the outside, genetic link to murder on the inside. To confirm, detectives needed fresh DNA. In the United States, the legal framework allows for what is known as a trash pull, collecting discarded items left for public waste. Supreme Court rulings have long held that once trash is placed on the curb, individuals surrender any expectation of privacy. investigators in Idaho Falls acted accordingly. One August morning, as garbage trucks cleared the street, detectives retrieved Ellison's trash bags. Inside were cigarette butts, tissues, and food containers. Each was carefully bagged and sent to the lab. The results were decisive. DNA from the cigarette butts matched perfectly with the unknown blood from the chevron scene. There was no statistical ambiguity, no wiggle room. The man who smoked those cigarettes in 2021 was the same man who bled in the storage room in 2011. To strengthen the case, detectives staged another opportunity. Ellison, observed at his regular cafe, left behind a coffee cup. Within hours, saliva from its rim confirmed the same match. The probability of error was calculated at less than 1 in a trillion. After a decade of silence, the killer's name had stepped from the shadows. At 50, 00, the story turns outward with a call to perseverance. 8. This is why we study the cold case files, because science can outlast time. Subscribe to help push cases like this to the finish line. 8. The shift was seismic. For years, the case had been defined by failure. Suspects dismissed, leads evaporated, community despair deepening. Now, through the combination of preserved evidence and modern science, the narrative had transformed. What CODIS failed to deliver, genealogy revealed, and what years of witness interviews could not provide, a single cigarette butt confirmed. Yet investigators knew the science was only the beginning. DNA placed Ellison at the crime scene, but building a courtroom narrative required more. They examined his past for evidence of volatility, questioning former co-workers who recalled flashes of temper. They noted the proximity of his job sites to the chevron in 2011. They reviewed cell tower records showing his phone pinging near Rexburg the night of the murder. Piece by piece, the portrait grew darker. But perhaps the most haunting detail was psychological. For over a decade, Ellison had continued life as though nothing had happened. He attended birthday parties, drove his children to school, bowed his head in Sunday prayers. All the while, the weight of his secret grew heavier. This, experts explain, is the core of dual life psychology. The mask of normalcy becomes not just a shield, but a prison, trapping the offender in constant fear of exposure. When science finally breached that mask, the collapse was inevitable. For the Moore family, the news of a suspect did not erase grief, but it brought the first true breath of hope in years. Rachel told a reporter she had heard promises of future technology for too long, but this time she believed it. The cold years of silence had not been in vain. The chevron ghost had a name, and science, patient, relentless, unyielding, had delivered it. When the DNA results came back conclusive, detectives moved quickly. In the early morning hours of October 2022, officers surrounded the quiet suburban home of Mark Ellison. The man who had lived for over a decade as a husband, a father, and a neighbor opened his front door to a swarm of uniforms. His arrest sent shockwaves through Rexburg. For many, it was almost impossible to reconcile the ordinary man they saw mowing his lawn with the brutal image preserved in the cold case file. The trial began the following summer. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision. The broken knife handle, the shoe prints, the blanket stained with 2 kinds of blood, and the genealogy trail that led unerringly to Ellison. Jurors were shown the chain of custody, each link reinforced by science and circumstance. Defense attorneys argued contamination, coincidence, or flawed databases. But the narrative of guilt grew stronger with every exhibit. At 53, 30, the focus turns to you. 8. If you sat on that jury, would the evidence chain leave any room for doubt? 8. For the 12 ordinary citizens sworn in, the answer was clear. After a week of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence? Life without parole. For Rachel Moore, the word guilty carried a strange weight. It was relief, yes, but also exhaustion. Justice had come, late, scarred by a decade of waiting. As legal scholars often say, justice delayed is justice denied. Yet in Rexburg, people also felt that delayed justice, though imperfect, was still justice delivered. The community absorbed lessons. Local leaders pushed for greater investment in cold case units, higher resolution security cameras at 24-hour businesses, and staffing patterns to avoid lone overnight clerks. Police encouraged citizens to report even minor disturbances because what seemed small could prevent another tragedy. For the Ellison family, the verdict was shattering. They faced the stigma of his conviction, the collapse of a life they thought was ordinary. Dual grief unfolded. Rachel mourning Ethan, Ellison's children mourning the father they thought they knew. And so, the case closed, but the reverberations continued. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. The more people see these cold case files, the more likely another family will hear the word. Justice. 8. Because every solved mystery carries a reminder. Silence can last, but it cannot win forever.